So, Namaskar. My name is Ajay Dubey. I am chair for the National Security Studies program at Jawaharlal Nehru University. It's my pleasure to welcome the distinguished speakers at this second webinar on Afghanistan and Taliban. First of all, I would like to welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sri M. Jagdish Kumar, who had been a very strong support for our national security program. And in fact, he had been very active in terms of setting up this program and making it run. Thank you so much, sir, for being here. We also have the keynote speaker, Dr. Dan Schueftan, who is Director of National Security Studies Center, University of Haifa, Israel. And he had been to Jawaharlal Nehru University earlier. So welcome once again, sir, to this webinar.
Good afternoon.
We have three other participants who will be commenting and speaking on this. I think Professor Arvind Kumar has also joined. I see him. Please admit him. Yes, he is joining. We have Sri Shyam Parandeji, who is the Secretary General of Antarashtriya Sahayog Parishad, which is Indian Council of International Cooperation. We have Professor Arvind Kumar, who is the chair of the Center for Canadian, US, and Latin American Studies. And we have two colleagues from the center, Dr. Lakshman Kumar Behra and Ms. Ayushi Ketkar, who is from National Security Studies Program of JNU. So welcome to all of you. As all of you know that this is the second webinar on Taliban in Afghanistan. In the first one, we discussed in great detail the implication and strategy for India. As we discussed that India had engaged Afghanistan in developmental processes, in capacity building, in infrastructure. And for 2 decades, it invested over $3 billion US, thinking that Afghanistan will become a democratic liberal setup with which India can engage. But we had seen the coming back of Taliban with such massive strength and occupying more area than what it had when it was last time in power. And it has implication not just for India, but also for the entire region and for the globe. And this seminar intends to discuss Taliban in Afghanistan, which has implication for the region and for the globe, because India too has a global and a regional interest. And it is in this context that looking at Taliban in Afghanistan from an India-centric view alone is not enough. We need to understand this change of the regime and establishment of Taliban regime in Afghanistan from a perspective where the regional and global implications and the space, role, and strategy for India has to be informed by that. And it is in this connections that this time we have invited very distinguished speaker and panelists for this topic. We have Professor Dan Schueftan from Israel and the 3 other panelists that I just welcome before you. The overall implications, the nature of Taliban in Afghanistan is known to all of you. But for this webinar, we have just shortlisted a few questions, given the shortage of time that webinars are organized for. What are the threats to regional security to post-Taliban takeover of Afghanistan? So the regional threat is one aspect that we will be covering in detail. The second is impact for jihadi forces post-Taliban victory in Afghanistan, because it is just not confined to Afghanistan. The issues of Afghanistan, if it was just an issue for Afghan people, we would have got a different approach. But the jihadi forces, the kind of boost up network and support that they will get, or will they not get, is what we will discuss today. The third aspect that we would like to focus on is the changing contours of emerging regional and global geopolitical construct post-Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. What will be the role of US, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, among others, in the emerging geopolitical orders? The collapse of US-led democratic regime in Afghanistan and advent of Taliban has changed the geopolitical situation of the region, also the global, in a very significant way. We had seen how after Doha talk, the Taliban, whatever they wanted to commit as a part of that agreement with USA, they are not honoring. And they are doing things which was not acceptable in that talk. We have seen how US is getting isolated in the region where China, Russia are pushing their agenda together, along with Pakistan and Turkey becoming an important player in the region. And India, which has invested so closely, took a risk of even losing a person at ambassador level, who also happened to be our batchmate in JNU, is now having very little choice. The issues of recognition, the issues of engaging Taliban is something that one needs to discuss, not just on the basis of Doha round, but the overall historical experience of the country, of the regime that has come to the power, and since last 15th of August, the way it is unfolding its different facets compared to what it committed in Doha round. The last question that we would like again to discuss is what would be the nature of US involvement in regional security order post-Taliban takeover? Will it focus more on Indo-Pacific Quad at the center to counter China and its allies? So these are some of the regional implications and global implications that we would like to focus on. We have very distinguished panelists, but first of all, I would like to invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sri M. Jagdish Kumar, whom all of you know. For I see there are some international participants as well. For them, he is Vice Chancellor of JNU, and at the same time, he is teaching and supervising PhD student at IIT Delhi. He obtained his PhD degree from Department of Electrical Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Professor Kumar works in the area of nano-electronic devices, nano-scale device modeling, and simulation innovation design and power designs and power semiconductors design. He has more than 250 publications in referred journals and conferences. Several patent applications have been filed based on his research. He is a fellow of Indian National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Science, India, and Institute of Electronic and Telecommunication Engineer. He has been awarded 29th IETE RL Wadhwa Gold Medal for distinguished contribution in the field of semiconductor device design and modeling. He received the first ever ISA VSI Technology Mentor Award given by the Indian Electronics and Semiconductor Association to recognize a distinguished Indian academician and researcher for playing a significant role as a mentor and researcher. He is a recipient of 2008 IBM Faculty Award in recognition of professional achievements. But first, most important is that he is the initiator and the one who visualized this National Security Studies program and finally got it established at JNU. So welcome, sir, for this second webinar. Over to you to give the inaugural address.
Thank you, Professor Dubey. Let me first of all extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Dan Schueftan from Israel, who is a great friend of India. He visited JNU too earlier, and then all the distinguished participants of this webinar. Today we have joined in this second webinar on issues related to Afghanistan, and very rightly you have in the title of this webinar both implications and the strategy. Implications, are they what we see in the media, or are there some deeper issues that we need to look at the possible implications of the Taliban rule in Afghanistan and where it will take us in future? And when we talk about future, then obviously when we work on the strategies to deal with the situation, which may have very serious security implications, not just only for India but for the rest of the world, we need to think about how we can develop a strategy of cooperation among the democratic societies and other powers of the world, so that the situation that is evolving in Afghanistan will not impact us in any detrimental way, whether it India or other peace-loving countries across the world. And in this context, that webinars such as this, organized by our Special Center for National Security Studies, they become very important, because what we see in the media, what we read in the media may not really provide the real picture of what is happening. It is important that academicians and experts such as Dr. Dan and other academicians across the the academic world, they need to come forward and they need to analyze critically and also educate the students in the educational institutes. In this context, I believe that this webinar is very important, and I would like to congratulate Professor Ajay Dubey and the team of young faculty colleagues that we have in our Special Center for National Security Studies for thinking about organizing this series of webinars to educate the general public on the implications and strategy. And during last few days in Indian media, there was a lot of discussion about a course that we started at JNU. As you know, JNU is a university which encourages multidisciplinary education. So we wanted to teach our engineering students international relations as part of their education. And one of the courses that our team of faculty members have designed is on counter-terrorism, asymmetric conflicts, and strategies for cooperation among major powers. There has been a lot of discussion in Indian media why such a course being offered in JNU, what is the need at this time. But this kind of arguments come because of the lack of understanding, because of the ignorance that is prevalent about the dangers of situations such as those developing in Afghanistan and in other parts of the world. So this is the reason why I think educating our students to be aware about the need for better cooperation, the need for developing counter-terrorism approaches, whether it is technology or diplomacy, international relations, it is extremely important. And unless we have a critical number of specialists who understand these issues deeply, it will be very difficult to develop national as well as international strategies to counter these kind of terrorism which is emanating out of religious fundamentalism and radicalization of youth. So therefore I would like to extend my appreciation to the faculty members in JNU who are developing such courses, and also the colleagues in the Special Center for National Security Studies for conducting webinars of this nature and for bringing wonderful experts such as Dan, who has very kindly agreed to be part of this webinar and then enlighten us with his insights on this topic. So with those comments, I would like to once more extend a very warm welcome to all the participants of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, our Honorable Vice Chancellor. Very well said. The entire discourse, the narrative on explaining the internal and external situation had been going just one way. There had been no counter narrative. There had not been a critical look on the entire situation that India was confronting in the past or is confronting presently, domestically or externally. And therefore, it is very important for us that we must not be carried by this media discourse, the discourse of intellectuals who for the last 60, 70 years had been saying only one way in name of being critical. But when anybody else take them on critically, they are feeling very uneasy about that. So thank you for encouraging this kind of discourse, creating a space for different kind of perspective and views, to making university an open space where all views are welcome. Criticality, there is no iconic person, there is no iconic views, there is no iconic perspective. It's the university which questions everything, and it must keep questioning rather than keep conforming as it was done in the past. And your contribution in encouraging such courses in JNU and establishing Center for National Security Study is great, because it is generating a new narrative, new critical analysis compared to what had been in the past. It's from this perspective, again, we have a very distinguished scholar, Professor Dan Schueftan, who is Director of National Security Studies Center at University of Haifa and the Israel Defense Forces National Defense College. He was a visiting professor at the Department of Government, Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. For the last 4 decades, he had been consultant to Israeli decision makers and to the Israeli national security establishment, and he regularly briefed senior political leaders and officials in the United States and Europe. Dr. Schueftan had published extensively on contemporary Middle Eastern history, with emphasis on Arab-Israel relation, inter-Arab politics, and American policy in the Middle East. His book include Jordanian Option, Israel, Jordan, and Palestinians, published in 1986. Attrition, Egypt, Post-War Political Strategy, 1967-1970, published in 1989. Several of them are there. Disengagement, Israel and Palestinian Entity, published in 1999. Palestinian in Israel, the Arab Minority and the Jewish State, 2011. He had been a visitor to JNU earlier, and we have heard his view. He covers the entire region in a very extensive way. So over to you, Professor Dan Schueftan, to give the keynote address.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you all for the very warm welcome that I'm getting there. And I hope when the world is on course again, I can come again to you. You can come to us. We can see each other in person. I'll be delighted. I want to discuss 4 issues this afternoon. First of all, to speak about Afghanistan. What is the problem with the American policy in Afghanistan and how it affects the region? Then I want to specifically speak about the Middle East and speak about the impact of what has happened in Afghanistan and the trend that we've seen in American foreign policy recently over the Middle East, over the particularly this part of the Middle East where Israel is, the Arab Peninsula, the Fertile Crescent, North Africa. Then I will try to explain why the American policy in the Middle East, particularly under President Obama and also now under President Biden, is based on a profound misunderstanding of the Middle East. And finally, I want to speak about what the allies of the United States can do. On the one hand, strengthening the alliance with the United States. On the other hand, not always listening to American advice, because the Americans, unfortunately, don't have a very good record of success, as we've seen now in Afghanistan. What is the problem, first of all, in Afghanistan itself? We all know the proverbial distinction between a wise man and a clever man. A clever person can find his way out from a predicament that a wise man would not fall into in the first place. So the problem is that the Americans were not wise and are not clever. They were not wise because they went to Afghanistan to bring democracy there, and they're not clever because they couldn't extract themselves from this predicament, from this mistake, in a way that minimizes the damage. A damage was expected, but it could have been minimized, and the way it was done was not professional. But I want to go back to what I consider to be the 5 major mistakes that the United States made, not only in Afghanistan, it goes beyond it. And you will see immediately that it also has an impact today, because the same mistakes Americans were making in the 1950s and made 20 years ago, they're now about to make in other parts, or if not the same, then very similar mistakes. And I think that once we understand it, we know what to expect, and in this sense, not to expect too much. First of all, Americans insist on fixing what is terminally broken. Now, if there is something broken and you can fix it, by all means, fix it. But if you realize, and you should realize, that in some societies, some countries, things are so terminally broken that you can't fix it, and then when you're trying to, it doesn't work. When you come to societies like Afghanistan, and you're trying to bring democracy to it, it is something that cannot be done, because such a profound cultural change must come from within. It can be assisted from without, but it cannot be injected from without. Not with the Marines and not with beautiful speeches, not the way that Bush tried to bring it in, and not the way that Obama tried to phrase it beautifully so that people will be convinced. When you come to a country with a different culture, you can't bring in pluralism and equality for women and democracy and modernity to a country that doesn't want it, to a society that doesn't want it. To give an example from Israel, you can bring many things to Israel. One thing you cannot bring, patience. We Israelis are impatient. I mean, I have a sign on my desk. It says, God, give me patience, but I want it right now. I mean, this is Israel. We have no patience. Nobody can bring patience to Israel. Nobody can bring democracy to Iraq or to Afghanistan, or equality of women to Afghanistan. If the Afghans themselves want it and they work at it for a few generations, it can be done. We have seen cultural changes, cultural revolutions in Muslim countries. I mean, look at Turkey. It had it twice in 1 century. 100 years ago, the Turks with Ataturk had one kind of cultural revolution. And now with Erdogan, unfortunately, in the other direction, another revolution. So I'm not saying you can't change culture. I'm saying you can't change it from without. Very difficult to explain to Americans. The second point is, Americans don't understand radicalism. They think that a radical is a reasonable person that had a difficult childhood. And therefore, he was treated unfairly. And if we treat him nicely, he will stop being a radical. They don't understand. There are only 2 options, a strong radical or a weak radical. If you're against the radical, don't try to change his radicalism, just break him, undermine him, weaken him, so that, first of all, his radicalism will not undermine your major interest. And more important, other potential people will look at it and they will see that radicalism doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, the chances that they will adopt it are somewhat lower. So this idea of radicals not being open to dramatic change, again, from without, is something very difficult to explain to Americans. The third is that the only way you can deal with a major problem that is far away from America is to have local partners. Namely, you come to somebody in the same region, understanding a similar culture, with the experience of dealing with radicalism in this region, and you work with him and you strengthen him, rather than the American approach saying the following: he's already my friend, I have an enemy. If I also make the enemy my friend, everybody will be my friends and we will all be happy and ride into the sunset and live happily ever after. No. Partner with the good guys from your perspective against the bad guys, strengthen the good guys, and sometimes, if you pardon my French, strengthen the local people who you don't like. Americans sometimes call them the negative, the positive sons of bitches against the negative sons of bitches. Namely, you don't have to find nice partners. There are very few nice partners around the world. Some of the partners you have to work with are not very nice. To give only one example, the United States worked with Stalin during the Second World War against Hitler. Stalin was terrible, but he was an effective ally during a certain part of the Second World War. So don't try to bring democracy to your partners who are not democratic, just work with them. So not only don't try to bring democracy to Afghanistan, but also not to Saudi Arabia or to Egypt, because again, these changes can only come from within, and you cannot bring it in from the outside. The last element, or the next element, is if you have a local partner who shares your value system, but has a lot of experience with the radicals in this region, don't try to educate your partner because he knows much better than you do how to deal with radicalism in his own region. So trying to tell your partners to be nice when they know that it doesn't work in this region will only make your objective less attainable. Last but not least, and this is not specific to America, this is true throughout the Western world, you have a choice between doing good and doing what looks good. If it looks good, it is usually counterproductive. If it works, it doesn't look good, usually. So your real choice when you're adopting a policy is, do you want the war to be protracted? If you want it to be protracted, do what looks good, then it will be protracted, and you will have to do what looks bad for a longer period of time. In the final analysis, if you want to be effective, you can't look good by every means that you're choosing. So better do the things that don't look good immediately, because otherwise the war will be protracted because you have adopted a measure that doesn't work. This is as far as the basic principles concerning the region in the wider sense are concerned. I'd like to discuss now the Middle East in the more narrow term, namely the term that includes essentially the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. Speak a little bit about the American policy, speak about the impact of what happened in Afghanistan to this region, and later, as promised, I will also try to speak about what the partners of the United States in this region, in this part of the world, can do. First of all, when you look at the Arab world, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, the major issue, more important than everything else put together, is at the moment the issue of Iran. Now, it should be self-evident, but Obama, not understanding it, had this fantasy that the only thing that counts, or the most important thing that counts, is the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue is not only not the most important, not only is it not marginal, it is on the border of even not being negligible. It is a non-subject in the Middle East. It doesn't matter. No matter what happens with the Palestinians, the impact on the Middle East is zero. If we have on the one extreme tomorrow peace everlasting between Israel and the Palestinians, or a major eruption of violence, the impact on the Middle East is exactly zero. And when it comes to Iran, everything finally hinges on Iran, on what it can do, on what it is prevented from doing. And today, the Biden administration is by far not as bad as the Obama administration in not understanding what's happening in the Middle East, but there is a danger that they will underestimate the significance of Iran and therefore adopt a policy that is counterproductive. Now, what is the question? I cannot tell you what will happen, but I can tell you what the major questions are. There are two options in the Middle East concerning the American policy vis-a-vis the region, Iran, and the impact on the region itself. At the moment, there is a very positive trend in the region because the Arab states, and they are the overwhelming majority of countries in the region, realized how weak and how vulnerable they are. First of all, the complete failure of the so-called Arab Spring. Not only is the situation today in the Middle East worse than before the Arab Spring started more than a decade ago, but also most Arab states not only are extremely weak, but they are aware of their weakness. And this is very important when it comes to policy, because people don't pursue a policy based on the realistic balance of power, but on their perception of the balance of power. And today, the Arab perception is very accurate. They understand that they are extremely weak. The second point is that during the Obama administration, Arab states in the region realized how much they cannot trust the United States. On the one hand, the United States is on their side and very strong. On the other hand, the United States policy was counterproductive, strengthening their enemy, Iran, and weakening them. So the understanding that you can't trust the United States runs very deep. And the understanding at the same time that Israel is much weaker than the United States, but much more determined to fight against Iran, and therefore is much more trustworthy, is also very deep today. And unlike the old reality where we used to speak about the Arab-Israeli conflict, namely the Arabs on the one hand and Israel on the other, today most Arab states are in coalition with Israel against Iran, against the Muslim Brothers, and against Erdogan in Turkey. So today, it is no longer the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel has a conflict with a few Arab states. Yes, with Syria. Yes, with Lebanon, to the extent that Lebanon is still a country. Yes, with the Palestinians. But most Arabs are with Israel against the radical elements in the Arab world. So the question is, will the Democrats coming back to the White House again bring the situation to what it was in the Obama era or not? If it will go back to Obama, the problem will be very serious because Obama strengthened Iran and weakened the Arab states and Israel. If Biden, that doesn't go as far as Obama and is not ideologically committed as Obama is to this misperception of the Middle East, if he will learn from the experience of Afghanistan, then perhaps the chances of an Arab-Israeli-American coalition against Iran will be the most effective tool, the most effective policy that you can have in the Middle East. And again, we are coming back to the same misperception. Americans did not understand Nasser. They don't understand Erdogan. They don't understand North Korea. They don't understand Iran. They don't understand radicalism. And they don't understand that the only choice that you have today in the Middle East, will a radical Iran be strong or will a radical Iran be weak? Iran is radical, period. By the way, if you need something that symbolizes it, look at the elections in Iran. But this is only the symptom. The disease is much deeper. Iran is radical. Iran is very dangerous for the region and beyond. The question is only, will the Americans strengthen radical Iran or will the Americans weaken radical Iran? And the problem again with American policy is that even when they do the right thing, or even if they want, let me rephrase it, even if they want to achieve something that is worth achieving, the order of priority is such that they are undermining their broader strategic objective. Let me give you an example. Was it a good idea from an American point of view to fight Daesh, ISIS? Yes. Is ISIS an enemy that needs to be undermined? Yes. But when in the process of fighting ISIS, you strengthen Iran and basically give Iran the control of Iraq. If in the process of fighting ISIS, you strengthen Erdogan at the expense of your allies, the Kurds in Syria. If in the process of fighting ISIS, you invite Russia to come into Syria, you're being counterproductive. You're winning a minor battle and you're losing a major war. And this is exactly what the United States did, particularly under Obama. And when it comes to the nuclear issue, again, I think the Americans misperceived the issue because nuclear weapons in Iran are different than nuclear weapons in India, in Pakistan, in North Korea, and in Israel. Because in all these cases, in spite of the enormous difference between them, it is basically a defensive measure. Even when it comes to a very radical country like North Korea, it is not an instrument in order to take over all of Asia, okay? You are speaking about countries who basically have a defensive objective in their nuclear capability. Iran wants to take over the Middle East, can take over the Middle East because the Arabs are so weak and the Iranians are so strong, is in the process of doing it and already succeeded in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Syria. And it is only an instrument in order to give the Iranians immunity from conventional reaction. And therefore, this is not where you need to focus. And going even deeper into a worse American misperception, they're focusing in the renewal of the JCPOA on enrichment. On enrichment, they have already lost the battle. The Iranians have develop themselves very advanced centrifuges, and they can enrich as much as they want. What they want is immunity for weaponizing and ballistic missiles. And Americans basically give them immunity for ballistic missiles and weaponizing by dealing with the war that they've already lost concerning enrichment. And more important than anything else, they're giving them legitimacy and immunity to take over the Middle East while they're dealing with the nuclear issue. So we have a major American misperception concerning Iran and the wrong means in order to deal with the challenge of Iran. The problem with the United States is that they think in operative terms about strategic issues, and they have a structural misperception of societies, of their culture, of the center of gravity of strategic issues. By the way, does it mean that if you are an American, you must be always wrong? No, let me give you an excellent example. The best foreign policy that the United States had was under Nixon and Kissinger. And these guys understood the world and were extremely effective and extremely successful. So it doesn't follow that if you're an American, you must follow the wrong policy. But what we've had, particularly with Obama, and if you want to go back with Jimmy Carter and with Eisenhower in the 1950s, is the same American approach that is counterproductive to American interest. Let me end my presentation by speaking about what the allies of the United States can learn from what I've said so far. And I think here is something where India and Israel have something in common. You know, the enormous difference between the size and the potential of India and Israel is, of course, striking, but we may have something in common after all, in spite of the fact that India is by far more important on the global scene than Israel. First of all, wanting to be on the American side, working with the Americans, having a very good relations with the United States, being in partnership with America, doesn't mean that you have to follow American mistakes. In other words, you can, on the one hand, want to work with the United States, realize that in the final analysis, they are the guarantor of freedom in the world against China, as they were against Germany and against the Soviet Union. And you can be very pro-American on the one hand and take with a mountain of salt, not with a grain of salt, but with a mountain of salt, the advice the Americans give to you. You know your region, you know what to do, you know that what works in California does not necessarily work in Kashmir. You know that there are very different approaches that you must take than the American approach. And the most important one is, don't try to befriend your enemy, try to undermine your enemy. Americans believe that enemies can become friends. They can become friends after you burn them and you bomb them and you destroy them and you break them. Germany became the friend of the United States after the United States bombed Berlin. Japan came on the American side after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When you destroy your enemy, later they can say, oh, it's too dangerous to be the enemy of the United States. Let's be friends of the United States. In very extreme cases, you can become the friend of the United States without being bombed, just by having similar values. Fine, that's better. But the idea that the bad guys and the barbarians become your friends just because you're nice and you're counterproductive doesn't work. So both India and Israel, who are not in conflict with America, who want to work with America, who don't need to be bombed by America because we want to be on the American side because it serves our interest. I mean, the Israeli interest, the Indian interest must not take too seriously what Americans say about their enemies, but we must ask ourselves, where did it work when America was changing the attitude of its enemies? I'm not saying it's possible in every place. I'm not saying that if you bomb Afghanistan enough, they will be on the American side. They will not. You can deter them. You can make it very painful for them to be your enemies, but you can't make them your friends by rebuilding their society. This is too ridiculous. So when a local ally of the United States wants to hit very hard their own enemies who are also enemies of the United States, and the Americans are trying to restrain us, let us listen to them very politely and then do what we think is best. And on this happy note, let me perhaps end here, and I'll be delighted to respond to comments and contributions of others later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dan, for giving your perspective, both global and regional, and suggesting the strategy how to deal with. Also highlighting what Americans should do to set things right in the Middle East, but I'm sure Israelis are competent enough and had been doing in the past, setting things right themselves, rather than being dependent on American, whether it is with Israel, with some of its enemies, how you had been able to find peace, and you know the method better, and that is reflected in your talk today. Thank you so much for bringing this perspective, which is not usually heard in this part. Now we have another very distinguished participant, Sri Shyam Parandeji, who is Secretary General of Indian Council for International Cooperation. As all of you know, that India has a significant diasporic population in Afghanistan. It has very significant heritage presence in Afghanistan, and therefore, from that perspective, also we look at the arrival of Taliban as a regime in Afghanistan. Sri Shyam Parandeji had been with Indian diaspora for a very long time. He had worked with Indian Council of International Cooperation right now, but before that he was very active in several initiatives as a social worker. He is also associated with Seva International, which is a global NGO. But the Antarashtriya Sahayog Parishad, with which he is working, and he is the Secretary General of that, is one of the oldest organizations which was trying to connect with Indian diaspora when the word diaspora was, Indian diaspora itself was not an acceptable, respectable term in the previous regimes. So Shyam Parandeji had been a very leading figure in connecting with Indian diaspora and its heritage resources outside. Over to Shyam Parandeji. You have to unmute yourself, Shyamji. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Professor Dubey. It was great listening to Dr. Dan Schueftan. The way he has put forth his views has enriched the discussion. He presented it substantially in a lucid way. So I appreciate that and all the views that he has expressed. We, from Indian side, do agree or more than agree with all his views. As you already said, it's Antarashtriya Sahyog Parishad, Indian Council for International Cooperation that I work for, and Seva International, which also works with the diaspora or encourage diaspora to serve local communities all over the world. So it's diaspora focused activity that I do. And talking about the Indian diaspora in Afghanistan, well, till 1947, when we got freedom and the partition together, there were a lot of diaspora from Afghanistan because Afghanistan and India had a common border and we had a live trade. As a matter of fact, most of us might have watched Kabuliwala, the famous film or the novel that Rabindranath Tagore had written. And Kabuliwala was a part of our cultural heritage, as a matter of fact, because they used to travel to India, and Indians used to travel to Afghanistan and beyond. The Uttarapatha, the road that traveled to the north and the west, passed through Afghanistan. And that way, many Indians had settled there for businesses and trade. And there were huge establishments, as a matter of fact. This continued till, say, 1969, and then even extended till 1979. It was the USSR encroachment or walking down into the roads of Kabul, streets of Kabul. And that's where it all started. Before partition or during the partition, there was an influx of refugees from Afghanistan, and then this was the second stage of refugees coming from Afghanistan. Many of them have settled in Delhi itself. However, till 79 or beyond even, the Afghanistan government had Indians as ministers. They were a member of parliaments, there were ministers who had to leave that land post 1979, or the way Taliban has risen, took over the reins in Afghanistan. Most of them had to travel out. Afghan Hindus and Sikhs have now spread all over the world, as a matter of fact, in all corners of the world. They are doing absolutely well. They are into trade, they are into industry, they are in academics, they're all over. And those who have settled in India, or majorly in North India, Delhi with its center, Delhi has localities where they are Afghan Hindus or Sikhs staying together, like Tilaknagar and others. So these are the localities where they have built their own temples, and wherever they go, they have their own temples, and they come together. They have, a sort of camaraderie amongst themselves, and it still continues. However, since last 20 years, what we had been watching since 2001, it was impossible to stay in Afghanistan. The last lot, as a matter of fact, though in phases, they came out, they were forced to come out of Afghanistan. They traveled to various countries as refugees, like in Europe, like in USA, like in Canada, like in Australia. We find Hindus and Sikhs from Afghan who are now settling. And now, in the last phase, though we are talking about many things, that there are Hindus and Sikhs, but there are very few left. Like before 2 months, when it came to count, there were less than 150 families left over there, the Afghan Hindus themselves, the Afghan Sikhs themselves, not the Indian workers or the NRIs who are working there in development projects and otherwise. The local population of Hindus and Sikhs had reduced to that small population, and nobody now talks about them. And there was a news that we have seen all over the newspapers and the TV is that some of them, being assured by the Taliban, have decided to go back to their villages and start their trade. It's not at all a proposal that can be worked out. There might be a couple of them, and not more than that. Rest of all of them have left the borders of Afghanistan for good, and they don't think that they will go back. On the part of Indian government, because we are more worried about NRIs and our interventions in developmental interventions in Afghanistan, we have invested a lot of money over there. We need to take care of those NRIs or the workforce, and we are bringing them back. We have got most of them back, yet some of them are left because of the situation over there. There were frantic calls from Indians who were left, and they were wandering on the street or right opposite to the airport in Kabul. They wanted to board a flight and they could not. Many of them have missed. However, of late, since last flight that flew in from Kabul brought rest of them, and still there are a few left who could not reach to the airport, it is said. So that's the situation for Indian diaspora left over there or had come out. The planes that carried refugees to India had many local Muslims who wanted to leave Afghanistan, settle down somewhere out of Afghanistan. They looked towards India with a hope, and there is a good amount of population in Afghanistan who feel that they will be better if they get the ambience that India has, like democracy, like free society, like education and all that they are hoping that they will come to India. However, India already has many problems. Of course, we have CA in place that gives preferential proposition for Indians or NRIs who have settled there, or PIOs who have settled there and are coming back, Hindus and Sikhs especially. That needs to be done very well, and they should be supported whichever way possible. And we should also think beyond or look beyond that the Afghan population that we cannot support as refugees should be politely told that there are many other openings they may proceed or choose rather than India. And I think that would be a good policy. Thank you very much, Professor Dubeji. It was nice listening to the Professor Jagdish Kumarji and, of course, Dan Schueftan. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Namaste, Ji. Shyam Ji, thank you for highlighting the conditions of Indian diaspora over there, the policy that India is adopting for them, and suggesting that people originally from Afghanistan, other than Sikh and Hindu, how they should be handled by India. Thank you so much for your interventions and sharing your comments. May now I invite Dr. Lakshman Behra, who is Associate Professor at the Special Center for National Security Studies at JNU. His research interests include India's external security challenges and also the defense policy and planning. Before joining JNU, Dr. Behra worked in Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He has worked as a member and coordinator of a number of committees set up by Indian Ministry of Defense and government agency. He recently published a book on India's defense economy, planning, budgeting, industry, and procurement from Routledge Publication. Dr. Behra, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor M. Jagdish Kumar, Professor Ajay Dubey, Chairperson SC and SS, Dr. Dan, fellow panelists, and all the participants, good evening. It's a pleasure to be part of this international symposium and speak on a subject which has far-reaching implications on regional and global security than one would imagine at present. Well, I will be as brief as possible so that we have more time for our keynote speaker from Israel, who has vast experience on the subject and who has beautifully laid out the canvas through his influential and thought-provoking address for questions and comments from the audience. Well, as a small introduction, the swift takeover of Kabul by the Taliban on 15th August really stunned the global community. The big surprising element was the speed with which the Taliban took over the control of the country even before the full withdrawal of the US forces. The situation in Afghanistan is still evolving, but some broad contours are like as follows. Unlike previous Taliban regime, which ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, the present Taliban, which many say Taliban 2.0, seems to be much more organized, diplomatically more sophisticated, and more importantly, they control more areas than they did last time. There is hardly any organized resistance like the Northern Alliance in the 1990s. In fact, the little resistance that we saw in Pansir Valley seems to be falling apart. And so far, Taliban has been very careful in what they are talking, although the ground reality is a little different. Nonetheless, they have talked about inclusive government, respect for human rights, amnesty to government and security officials who worked for the previous US-supported Afghan regime. And more significantly, it looks like Taliban in the new form would most probably end up getting more international recognition than Taliban 1.0 could muster last time. Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey, besides Pakistan, the creator and supporter of Taliban, seem to be inching towards recognizing Taliban. Well, with the last US troop having taken the flight out of Kabul sky and Taliban being the ground, being the reality on ground, let's ponder over some of the implications. In my talk, I would highlight two implications, one on global war on terror, which I think Professor Dan has discussed from Middle East point of view, and the other on regional and global geopolitics. Now let's look at the implications on global war on terror. The US departure from Afghanistan will undoubtedly affect the war on terror in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Coming to Afghanistan itself, according to a recent UN report, there are around 10,000 foreign jihadists, many of whom are linked to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or its affiliate organizations such as ISKP, that is Islamic State Khorasan Province, which was behind the two deadly bomb blasts at Kabul airport on August 26th, in which 13 Americans and about 170 Afghans died. Now, it's true that following the Kabul airport attacks, the US carried out a drone attack on 28th, just 2 days later, on ISKP suspects. That particular US counter-terror attack was part of what President Biden said over the horizon capability, that the US is developing to hunt down terrorists. But according to me, this over-the-horizon capability has certain limitations, which will impact America's ability to hunt down the Islamic jihadists wherever they are operating. It's because the basic feature of any counter-terrorism or counter-terror operations is the local intelligence, which was plentifully available when US troops were in Afghanistan. The Afghan security forces, along with the US troops on the ground, provided that crucial intelligence. But with the US departure, there is a huge intelligence vacuum. Now, interestingly, maybe it's a sad turn of events. Due to that vacuum, the US has now a strange ally in the form of Taliban to hunt down the ISKP. Well, Taliban may provide some help on ISKP, given its difference with that organization, but it is very unlikely that Taliban will return the favor, especially when it comes to Al-Qaeda or some South Asia terror groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. From Indian perspective, I think this is going to be a major headache going forward, and Indian policymakers must watch it very carefully. Outside Afghanistan, the situation is no better. If I may add here, the fall of Kabul is seen by Taliban as a military victory over the mightiest army of the world. And this is the perception which is shared by many other jihadi organizations operating in other parts of the world. Now the jihadists are now pumped up with the feeling that if Taliban can defeat the US Army, they could defeat what they call infidels with little bit of patience and through heightened terror activities. So in a nutshell, we are likely to see more terror activities in the coming time in a vast swath of areas ranging from Yemen to Somalia, Syria, or maybe Israel and Jammu and Kashmir of India. Since we are talking about the strategies part of the symposium, I think countries like India and Israel would be better off if they intensify. There is a degree of coordination between these two countries, but the time has come to intensify that coordination of counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism activities to defeat the nefarious activities of the jihadists. Now I'll come to the implications on regional and global geopolitics. Now, to understand the implications on regional and global geopolitics, it is important to understand the context of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, this context is rooted in US decision to divert its attention or resources and military might from counterinsurgency and counter-terror operations in Afghanistan to focus on its principal challenges, which essentially come from China and to some extent Russia. In fact, if one looks at various national security documents issued by the US government recently, particularly since the Trump administration, this message is loud and clear. It is a fact that while the US troops were chasing jihadis in some distant Afghan caves, its principal rivals, Russia and China, were spreading their economic and military muscles beyond their borders to promote their geopolitical goals. This could be vividly seen in the context of China, which, having gained the maximum at the cost of US capital, technology, knowledge, and market, is now challenging the American supremacy in the West Pacific, particularly in South China Sea, East China Sea, besides threatening its other neighbors, including India. A large part of Chinese economic and military belligerence is due to the relative decline of US power and Beijing's ascendancy in global power status. Just to cite a few key stats about China's rising power and US relative decline. During the Cold War, Soviet Union's economy was never more than 44% the size of America's economy. But by 2021, China has already reached 75% of US GDP in normal market exchange dollar terms. And by 2026, it would be around 90%. So compared to 44% which the Soviet Union could achieve, China has already exceeded more than 70%. Now, not to mention in terms of purchasing power parity, China is already at par with US. So economically, China is at par with US. Now, in military terms, the US has no counter to Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles, such as DF-21D, which is a big threat to American aircraft carrier power projection in the Indo-Pacific. In emerging technologies, China has made rapid progress, particularly in artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, quantum computing, autonomous lethal weapon systems, and not to mention 5G, where China is far ahead of many other advanced countries. So in a nutshell, if the US has to maintain its global supremacy, it has no option but to focus on containing China's economic and military rise and reassure its allies and partners of American support. And that is why the tilt from Afghanistan to the Indo-Pacific. The US-China trade war that we are seeing right now is part of this game, diverting US attention from Afghanistan to the Asia-Pacific. And the US withdrawal from Afghanistan to focus more on Indo-Pacific is also part of the same game. We may disagree with the manner of US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but could hardly disagree with the US intent behind its withdrawal. Lastly, what is India's strategic interest in all of this? I think to understand that, we need to look at our own security threats. Of course, there are plenty of threats to India's national security, ranging from conventional military threats from China and from Pakistan and China to cross-border terrorism, cyber attacks, and many more, and at the same time under the nuclear overhang. But to me, the biggest strategic challenge that India today faces is China. the Doklam crisis of 2019, the Galwan crisis of 2020, in which 20 brave Indian soldiers lost their lives for the first time in the last 45 years, have further reinforced this point. I think India can handle terrorism, including those that may emanate from Afghanistan at the behest of Pakistan, given that New Delhi has huge experience in dealing with that kind of terrorism since early 1990s. But given the power difference with India, India would require a degree of assistance from key partners, particularly the US, with which New Delhi has forged a strong defense and security ties, particularly since Modi government came to power in 2014. So I'm not suggesting the US will fight India's war. India has to fight its own war if that situation comes. But what I'm saying is that an America that is fully focused countering China will be a great help to India in containing Chinese military belligerence. I think that is the biggest geopolitical development from Indian perspective. I think I will stop at this. Maybe I can respond to some queries during the question and answer session. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Behra, for giving a very comprehensive roundup of geopolitical situation around Afghanistan and some of the fallout for India. It's very important that despite having a very strong government that we have under Prime Minister Modi, which is focusing on India first, taking care of India in this international situation is the only way out, because nobody else will come to your rescue. And in that, the challenges that the government faces also need to be discussed at some level, maybe in a third seminar, where can we depend on just one channel of our external linkages and policy, that is bureaucracy? Do we need more channels to open up? Are other stakeholders in foreign area from India needs to rope in to consolidate and to achieve what Prime Minister Modi is trying to do in terms of India's engagement and putting India first in foreign policy engagement. Some of the old vested interests continues, and one has to take a very radical and critical view on those, however unpopular that might be. Why we are failing despite having a very good policy by Government of India and political leadership? Where are the problems? We had been able to address that under Prime Minister Modi for domestic developmental issues by bypassing many of the channels which were the real hurdles and creating direct link. Can we do something like this for our foreign engagement, where we had been investing badly and suffering badly because of the vested interest that comes in between? Can Prime Minister Modi initiative, which is seen worldwide, an experiment of reaching out directly to the beneficiary and population, also be replicated in foreign policy, where the political will and right objective get implemented rather than we are carried away or misinformed by intermediaries? That's very important thing that we need to discuss at some point of time, which is coming very clearly in terms of our policy in Afghanistan. Thank you so much, Dr. Behra. Now we have the questions on the chat box, the 4 questions. And should I read it out, Professor Dan? Most of them are addressed to you. Okay.
Yes, please.
So the first question is that the Afghanistan experiment where American failed and Taliban came to power is a failed attempt of empire building in post-Cold War phenomena, of failed nation building as in case of various Middle East states. I think you answered that partially, but maybe you would like to respond that, yeah.
Yes, just a short comment. First of all, I don't think that the United States is engaged in empire building. And the Americans even don't admit to engage in nation building. Actually, they have some elements of nation building, but they're not willing to call it. that. The problem is that even when Americans realize that they cannot achieve what they wanted, namely to bring democracy and peace and market economies to most countries of the world, they nevertheless believe that when they come to do something negative, in other words, to prevent terrorism against the United States, they also need to have a positive face of we're helping these nations, I don't know, develop women's rights and so on. I hope that the experience in Afghanistan will cool it down, but it's very much in the American nature to want to do it, to say we don't only come to prevent the bad things to us, we also want to promote the good things for everybody. I don't mind if Americans say it as long as they don't mean it. Unfortunately, they mean it. And the lesson must be, don't stay anywhere, even if you have to do something militarily. Do something militarily, don't stay there, don't try to fix the world. It is unfixable unless people are willing to fix it themselves. And unless they are willing to shoulder the responsibility and want some minor help, don't become engaged in it.
Thank you. The second question is again directed to you. Taliban have adopted a form of government similar to Iran having shura with a supreme leader. Do you think two common radical Islamic nations together can further strengthen and influence the radicalism in other regions of the world in near future? It's a question by Dr. Gautam Jha. Yes.
Well, the fact that you have two radical regimes, even two Muslim radical regimes, don't mean that they will work together automatically. I mean, look at two radical Muslim regimes that we have today in Iran and in Turkey. And sometimes on very isolated and specific cases, they work together, but they primarily have tensions between them. Iran and the Taliban used to have bad relations. And in recent years, they have learned to bridge over it because they have a common anti-American interest and because the Iranians don't want to have another enemy in addition to those that they already have. So at the moment, again, there is a tension between them. And I don't think that the fact that they're both radical Muslim regimes brings them together. It is other constraints that do it and not this common regime.
Thank you. The third again to you, Professor Dan. My question is, what are the challenges before United Nations in engaging with Taliban? Should it recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government? How can India leverage its position in United Nations? It is chairing the Committee on Taliban Sanction to engage with Taliban and now to counter the Chinese influence over Taliban.
Well, I struggle to find a polite way to answer this question because how do you say politely that the United Nations doesn't do anything of any significance anywhere and it's not important? I'll try to find a way to say it very politely, but I don't think I will succeed. It really doesn't matter very much.
Thank you. Yes. The last one is, yeah, it takes Taliban to keep nation. This is just a comment. This is just opinion. How far slow? How fast or slow should India be in engaging Taliban, which is inevitable sooner than later? Both Shyamji and Professor Dan can respond to that. Shyamji, would you like to respond to this? How fast or slow should India be in engaging Taliban, which is inevitable sooner than later? You have to unmute yourself. Yeah. Shyamji, you have to unmute. You have to unmute, Shyamji, you are muted.
Maybe the host can help him, sir.
Yes.
Gaurav, yeah, Gaurav, can you help him to unmute?
To unmute, Dr. Dan is co-host, and
Ajay, we
Yeah.
cannot mute him. He
I
has
think, yeah, got it.
Yes, please, Shyamji, yeah, you can talk
Well,
now.
we need to be extra careful in dealing with the Taliban, and as a matter of fact, should be watching the situation for a longer period of time, unless we decide starting talking to them. So let's take a pause and then wait, watch, and then decide. This will be the best policy for the time being, I feel.
Thank you. Shyamji, again, there is a specific question directed to you.
Right.
That there are foreign students under ICCR from Afghanistan,
I know.
and a student who got offer for 2021-22 admission through ICCR. What is the plan for India? Can they receive visa in this regard?
It's difficult right now, unless until things settle down, to take a position on that. They'll to hold for that for the time being. The visas, unless until we have somebody over there in Afghanistan to issue visas, this won't happen. I think they will also have to wait for some time. And then, of course, there are many students, not only one, as somebody has asked. There are many students because we have a larger intake from Afghanistan in various universities in India. So, and many of them are waiting for the visas. Unless until situation in Afghanistan improves, I don't think this will happen so soon. We can try to help, but I don't expect that to happen.
Yes, Professor Dan, the next question, and this is the last question. Can you throw some more light on how India and Israel needs to work in tandem with USA on security front? And how can we completely conclude that rebuilding a nation may not give a soft power over them for the contributing nation? I think it's still there is some doubt. Yes.
I think India, the United States, and Israel are in a unique situation where both the value system of the three countries makes it much easier for us to cooperate, and also the strategic interests of India, Israel, and the United States are common. So I think it would be very helpful if you have a trilateral agreement. But I realize that compared to the United States and India, Israel is ridiculously small. So I feel very honored by being a part of a triangle, but this is not a triangle of equal partners, okay? Israel, with all due respect, is by far not a global power, not even a regional power with beyond the Middle East. We can assist, we have our expertise, we have the fields where we unfortunately have to excel in the military field and in the technological field. But this is, if a partnership between the United States and India is willing to include Israel, Israel should enthusiastically agree to it, not only because of interest, but also because of common values.
Thank you, Professor Dan. With this, we come to the end of this question. I think the question also raised some very valid point, and thank you for answering them very, very succinctly and precisely. Now, I would invite Ms. Ayushi Ketkar, who is Assistant Professor at the Special Center for National Security Studies, to give a vote of thanks. Ms. Ketkar, her PhD work is on cultural diplomacy. She taught at Gautam Buddha University and Amity University before joining JNU. Some of her publications include alternate approaches to security, NATO and European dialogue with India, geopolitics of the Himalayas, and she wrote some issue brief on Madarsa in India, and also report on Kashmir, the view from New Delhi. Over to you, Ms. Ayushi Ketkar.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, sir. Expressing gratitude is an age-old practice in the Indic traditions of India. It is my honor and privilege to undertake this task on behalf of the VC, Professor Jagdish Kumar, and the chairperson of the Special Center for National Security Studies, Professor Ajay Dubey. I would first of all like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Dan Schueftan for sparing his valuable time from a very rigorous academic schedule and enlightening us on an extremely critical topic of global, regional, and national importance. Thank you, sir, for that very enlightening talk of yours. I would go on to extend my thanks to the expert panelists comprising of Sri Shyam Parandeji, who is a grassroots practitioner of eminence, and my senior colleague, Dr. Lakshman Behra, for partaking in an extremely engaging and insightful discussion. I would be failing in my duty if I don't thank the most important component of any webinar, the attending participants, many of whom are experts in their own right on various aspects of national security. I thank my teammates at the Special Center for National Security Studies, Dr. Naresh Verma, Dr. Gaurav Tyagi, and Dr. Ankur Yadav for the logistic support that they provide for such glitch-free webinars. Last but not the least, gratitude to two very important mentors of ours, because of whom we are more than a sum total of the parts of our individual parts. First of all, it's our chairperson, Professor Dubey, who encourages us on a daily basis and provides us opportunities like these for capacity building and knowledge enhancement. And the head of our academic family at JNU, our VC, Jagdish sir, for giving us the autonomy to explore new areas and uncharted terrains pertaining to national security. Without you, sir, this center perhaps wouldn't see the light of the day. Hope to live up to your expectations and make the center a place of high quality research on national security in the days to come. Thank you all once again and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again. Professor Arvind Kumar has expressed his inability, so he could not participate. Maybe next time we'll have him. Thank you, sir, all of you to be here. Professor Dan, Professor Kumar, Shyam Parandeji, Dr. Behra, and all the participants who are here for coming, raising questions and participating and enlightening us on this very, very important issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.